The virtual CISO moment is brought to you by vCISO Services, a leading provider of quality and experienced virtual chief information security officers for small and mid-sized businesses. Check them out at vcisoservices.com. Hi, I'm Greg Schaefer, and welcome to the virtual CISO moment. Brent Forrest joins us today. He is a leader architect and strategic advisor of holistic security and has developed security programs across several industries. He is a graduate of Western Kentucky, Western Governors University. Sorry, WKU's right up the street. And a holder of the CISSP and the CISO and some other certifications. Brent, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
So, could you tell us a little bit about your cyber journey, the where you started and why you started in cyber, and how you got to where you're at today?
Funny enough, about 20 something years ago, I was actually a cable jockey installing phone systems and running voice and data cabling. And in about 2004, pivoted to Cisco voice over IP. And
Hmm.
from there, got into networking because voice over IP, if you don't understand networking, you don't really get voice over IP very well.
Absolutely.
So from there, because I just had a knack for picking things up and running with it, I got involved in routers, firewalls, wireless, and in 2012, I went back to an oil and gas company that I'd worked for many years prior, and they had a position for network and security administrator.
Hmm.
And from there, we just kind of started to evolve, but the real eye opening was a BEC attack on an email that came through and disrupted our processes. And just leaving it at that. Had to do a lot of investigations.
So,
And
so BEC, for those who don't know,
yep,
if I got my acronym
yes,
right, it's business email compromise, right?
correct.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes. Business email
We
compromise.
have a lot of acronyms in
We
IT and
do.
infosec stuff.
We have more than we probably should. Gardner helps out on those like every couple of years
They
too.
just invent more, I
I
think,
think
but
they do. I think they just go, BC is something we all know and we can work with. Okay, we need something else. Let's call it BFC for whatever reason.
I could take
uh,
that further, but I won't. Go
yeah,
ahead.
right. Um, so from that investigation, we ended up ripping out our email firewall platform and replaced it with Proofpoint. And we started injecting external tags in our subject lines because what we were finding was is that people were threat actors were sending in emails saying they were the CEO or the CFO, and people were believing it no matter how much we try to convince them, or the fact that maybe they sat 5 or 6 seats from like offices down from the CFO and never got up to go walk and ask him a question. Like, hey,
Well,
did
and
you
and
send
and
this?
you can only take. I'm a big proponent of information security awareness training. I huge proponent, but it can only go so far.
Correct.
There has to be a good mix of training and technology controls.
Yes, there needs to be technical and administrative controls. So,
Hmm.
technical controls, email firewall. Let's put the external subject. But administrative controls, they need to understand their policies and procedures, right?
Oh
So,
yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely. And I think sometimes when folks, we have folks reviewing their procedures and policies on an annual basis, but do they actually really read it, or they just kind of check the box? I don't know.
correct. Then kind of fast forwarding about 6 months, maybe a year later, I'd say the biggest push, the one where it said, "Oh, you're dabbling your feet in the short end of the pool. No, we're going to toss you headfirst into the deep end of the pool," was a pen test, our first that we ever did. And by day one, they had global admin rights. It was supposed to
Wow.
be an week external and a week internal. Well, external tests, they found a vulnerability in our VPN, was able to exploit that and get credentials. And then because We did not properly reboot servers after a patch or an update like we were supposed to. They were able to elevate and get system level access, and our
Mm.
endpoint protection never stopped it.
Ouch. That's a boy, that's a I'm sure the pen test folks were like congratulating themselves on that. It's pretty efficient. But so what happened with all that?
I did not sleep for a week. I kept getting phone calls. Oh, we're here. Oh, we're here. Oh, we're here. And crazy enough, we were using one of those network detection, the network, what do they call it? The network detection and response. I don't want to throw the name of the vendor out there, but they're the machine learning tools that, like,
Mhm.
hey, we learn your network. And I was in the middle of a POC
Oh,
of that.
user and endpoint behavioral analytics.
No, not a UEBA.
Okay.
It was one of the. This was not one of them that was in there. So think of it like Dark Trace.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Okay, I can say that because they were not the POC version.
I figured that.
Um, one of their competitors,
Mhm.
and so we were sitting there going through this pen test, and I went back and I started reviewing the logs. And one of the things is that everything that it picked up on the pen testers was like a score of like 10, 15, maybe 20 out of 100. And so nothing alerted, nothing grabbed its attention. But yet, what would continuously alert is every time our DBA was doing his traditional job of, hey, I'm going to package up this database file. It's about 4 gig, and I'm going to export it over FTP or SFTP to the vendor. And it flagged him every single time as a threat actor. But the actual pen testers, it never flagged.
That's and there was no white listing of the pen testers
No,
at all. So I'm gonna guess, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm gonna guess that probably that vendor failed their POC.
you would. You're assuming exactly 150% correct on that one. I actually went to deception with that. And so, interestingly enough, I had stood up the MHN Modern Honeypot Network,
Mhm.
where I had a couple of little deployed sensors. And unfortunately, because it was a standalone kind of like I just built it myself, and it had a website that you'd go to and it'd tell you who is touching your sensors. And it flagged all the Citrix boxes that they compromised, but it wasn't at the level of doing alerting or anything else. So what I did is I went to a vendor called TrapX that does deception and ended up purchasing their tool set to come in and stand up multiple honeypots throughout my
Mm.
environment. And I was an oil and gas company. I worked for an oil and gas firm. So I did it on the OT side, I did it on the corporate side. Don't ever recommend putting it on the public internet because it will
Mhm.
never stop going off. But let the universities that want to do that analysis, let them do that. Don't do
Uh-huh.
it in your own environment. But yeah, I ended up going away from that even concept of the machine learning mechanisms or the AI. I'm kind of in the line of they're both the same, just maybe a little bit different, even though
Mhm.
people will gladly argue that they are completely different. But hey, we all have our beliefs, right?
Well, and
So,
there's always overlap with some technical controls here and there. I always say that so long as you understand what the control is actually doing and what it's not doing, even more importantly, then that's good.
yes, correct.
So,
And that's where kind of defense in depth comes into play as well.
mhm.
So from
Absolutely.
there, I just started digging more and more into how did the pen testers get into my environment? How can I keep that from happening in the future? One, vulnerability management. So we implemented vulnerability management. MFA, we implemented MFA. Defense in depth on the perimeter firewall. So now I have a next gen firewall with an IPS IDS from another vendor. So I had two firewall vendors back to back,
Mhm.
one just doing IPS IDS and the primary doing the next gen.
Mhm.
And then I eventually moved off of a legacy endpoint protection tool to more of the next gen. At the time, it was Cylance. So now the next phase of all of this was to get everything into a centralized logging management and going down the Splunk route. And every time we would do pen tests from then on, I would actually, one, never tell my team that we were being pen tested because I was testing them as well as our controls.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. You don't want to spoil the milk, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Um, and then from there, we would then, once they discovered the pen testers, now I will say the first year that we went after the really bad year, the next time we had one, it took them an entire week to realize that we were being pen tested. And so we had to go through and figure out why.
Mm.
Turned out it kind of was like a target situation where the alerts were all going to an inbox folder that was not being reviewed.
Oh, that
So
happens a
we had
lot.
we
Yeah.
had some conversations around that, and that stopped after that. But then you fast forward after at pen test number 3, it took them 45 minutes to find the threat actors in our network. And
That's
on
a that's a good change right there. That's a very
exactly.
good change. Yeah.
And then the fourth one and the final one before I ended up leaving there was 30 minutes.
I think you bring up a very good point there too. It's a lot of times people are in IT and infosec, they're afraid of penetration tests because they're afraid of like something being discovered. But just like any audit, really, if you look at it as an opportunity to learn and then get better, which is what your team did. They learned, they
Mhm.
got better. I learned that lesson a long time ago with auditors that the best auditors that you have, whether they are doing technical auditing, which is essentially what a pen test is, or if they're doing auditing of your policies, procedures, and all of that, the best ones are the ones that are trying to not only find a gap, but also help you to understand what the gap is so that you can improve it. In financial services, for example, when banks are examined, that's the role of the regulators because they actually have skin in the game. They back up all the deposits. The FDIC is like a quarter million or something like that. So that's congratulations on that. I think that's wonderful that their response and their capabilities got that much better during that time.
Well, thank you. It was I'd take to the guys that were on my team that they once they found who, hey, there's a pen tester, they would go sit with the pen testers. And they would come up and they go, "Hey, can we go in there and just spend the like some hour like some time with them? Go for it.
Yeah, and
Enjoy
a
it."
good pen tester will allow you to do that. Some will just be
Correct.
like that. They just come in and no, don't bother me. Here's your report. Pay me my fee. So that's good. You found a good pen tester too, which is good.
And well, the nice thing was is it felt like it went from a red team versus blue team to a purple teaming simulation.
Hmm.
Whereas the first couple we didn't have that opportunity because it was they it was just a bad experience. Not a bad experience. It was a great experience. I will never go back to say that first pen test where I got the phone call on the day one that they got in externally and they got domain admin credentials on. I mean, yes, I didn't sleep for an entire week, but I learned so much from that engagement.
Being deprived of sleep has a tendency to do that for people.
Yes,
I've
yes, it
been there
does.
myself. So
And
so
I was
you left
thankful. Oh,
you left there and you're doing virtual CISO work now
I
or?
am actually. So I came to Flare Data Systems 2 years ago, and the goal was is to build out our cybersecurity practice. So I
Mhm,
wear many hats at Flare. Our internal CISO. So I'm lead our security initiatives here within Flare. And then I also started building out the security practice with our customer base, where I would go out initially and do assessments to
mhm,
find out where their tool sets were, where are they currently handling their security posture, right? And then it would take about an hour and a half, 2 hours of their time. And I would come back and then I would grade it and I'd give them a score and a roadmap of how they can improve their posture around cybersecurity.
mhm.
And
Go ahead, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, and then around 6 months ago, probably 7 months ago, it was May of last year that I went in and created our virtual CISO engagements, and I have two virtual CISO clients currently, and in the progress of bringing on more. But right now, I'm able to help our two customers where one is a high trust organization. So we're going through and I'm helping them with their assessments, helping with the security posture, making the recommendations that need to be there, as well as going in for log management because it's contained in the cloud. And we call it the high trust bubble, and everything to get into that environment is through a virtual VDI desktop. And so you can't just connect to it through the outside world without going through controls and mechanisms that are put in place to prevent that data.
Kind of like a jump box, it sounds like. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And so your organization Flare, you have two virtual CISO engagements right now. Do you have a particular vertical? You mentioned high trust, so obviously you work in healthcare, but do you just limit yourself to healthcare in that
No.
organization, or you across the board?
Across the board. For me, my playground would be oil and gas. I spent 20 years in oil and gas.
Hmm.
So if finding a virtual CISO in a virtual CISO engagement in the oil and gas, even if they're publicly traded or not, I've got a lot of experience working with the SOX compliance with internal auditors, the OT environment. I've spent a lot of time in the field. That
Hmm.
would be my personal niche. But with Flare, we're across the board. We've got financial, we've got education, we have local, state government. We're all over the place. We've got automotive.
Well, with that eclectic mix, what would you think would be currently right now? I know there's a lot out there. You'd mentioned BEC beforehand, but what is a significant threat to small and mid-sized businesses in general that perhaps maybe a CFO or CEO who's listening to this should be aware of as far as their information security posture?
Budget.
Budget. No, that's an interesting one. Let's drill down into that. So, what about budget is the biggest threat?
So there's this mentality that I've seen where we're not a target. And because they have this mindset of we're not a target, that they go back to we don't need to spend all that money on technology or security. We'll spend it on XYZ technology, but security is just too expensive. There's too much money going into, we can't afford it.
And whenever I hear that sort of an approach, I'll start to go down the path of, well, have you done any sort of a quantitative risk analysis about it? Because do you really know what your cyber exposure is? Um, do you see that even being something that would permeate into the thought processes of the C-suite of those companies that have that attitude, or are they just really heading down this long path that the only way that they're going to understand that security does have returns is if they get dinged, and then they have to pay all of the associated fees associated with getting dinged?
So it's funny you bring that up. I have a customer that is, they're a decent size organization, about 150-ish technical users, but they've got a large workforce that is in the field, and they're more in the construction side. They got hit with a ransomware last August, yeah, or last September. It was right at Black Hat, not in 2022, but in 2021, and they didn't like they went through, and as soon as they got through the ransomware event, it took them out 3 weeks, 4 weeks to get everything fully recovered through backups. The interesting part about it was is that not only when they got hit, but they got hit on a Tuesday. Thursday was payroll.
Oh, that's not good.
So they had to go back and start recovering everything to start payroll on Wednesday, because just because payday is on Thursday, they got to start processing everything on Wednesday.
Right.
So we went through and helped them through that incident, and I played. We call it the I play the quarterback for our ransomware engagements, and we've went through, helped them get that situated. We brought in a digital forensics team to figure out patient zero. Turned out it was part of hafnium. Um, but going back to your original question of how do you think the C suite is going to start looking at that? Well, in this certain engagement, the CEO, as much as he loves his company and as much as he loves his team, still felt like every dollar was a lot. I mean, but the CFO was able to help articulate to the CEO, like, no, we need to do this and to keep this from happening again in the future. And it turned out this was their second ransomware attack in over a few year period.
Well,
And so it was a hard conversation to have,
it
but at
is,
the
it
end of
always
the day,
is. Yeah.
they implemented a few of the controls that we recommended, technical controls, but the one that I think that they really need to look into, like with most of them, is security awareness training. I mean, you can go high end, right? You can go in the middle. So, for example, if you were a Proofpoint customer, Proofpoint has security awareness training.
Right.
If you don't, there's no before. There's even wiser training with Gabby. He's
Right.
all over LinkedIn if you're not familiar with him, but wiser training is one of those that give you 2 or 3 minute training sessions once a month. I mean, that's really good way of getting into people's head continuously.
Well, and the whole, I guess the root cause of all that is you touched on it, the perception that information security, cybersecurity are cost centers, and that any dollar that I put into it is a wasted dollar. And I can appreciate that approach to an extent because, um, particularly like a small business like I run, I mean, every dollar is important, but you have to always think about the consequences. It's like insurance. It's like cyber insurance, for example. But that's why I have used successfully fair factor analysis of information risk to give a high level example of like, okay, so here's your cost exposure, and your cost exposure because you don't have this one control in place is say $50,000 a year annually, and this is how we figured it out. But this control will cost you $10,000 a year. So that gives them now, the owner, the CEO, the C-suite, they're not actually wasting 10,000, they're potentially averting 50,000. And that's, I mean, that's obviously not a perfect science, but it gives them a little bit of a better tool. So,
And actually, the last ransomware incident that we went through with another organization, that they're still considered, I wouldn't call them enterprise. They're right below that. They're about eight or, well, no, never mind. I take it back. They've recently did a bunch of acquisitions that put them over the 1,000 employee mark. They're at about 1,100. So they would be considered that enterprise level. They went through a ransomware event where it was an email compromise. The user downloaded an email. It was interesting. It was a link in an email. They clicked it. They downloaded the zip file that was password encrypted with the password in the email. They unlocked it, extracted it, and it was an Excel macro based file. And then
that's
from there,
that's a lot of hoops to jump through
it
to
was.
get compromised. So,
And
but
so it happened. And what ended up going on was is that the threat actor got in on a Tuesday, clicked the encrypt button on a Friday. They were able to pivot through the entire server infrastructure, deleted half of their backups, and it was not a fun situation for that customer, but they handled it well with good strides. The C level supported them fully,
mhm,
and we were able to put in a quite a few new technical controls like MFA through one of the larger MFA providers. We migrated them right afterwards. They were already in the process, but we were able to click the button for it, was to move them off of on-prem Exchange to Office 365.
right.
Better in endpoint protection, MDR, uh, PAM solutions, and so they're going through and they're just having to take a huge learning curve at that moment. but it was all at the direction of their CTO to go, we cannot have this happen again.
Well, you use the words "not fun," and, one of the things in cyber and information security is that a lot of the things we deal with are not fun and can be stressful, and you mentioned at one point in time, very little sleep, if any, over a period of a week. So, what's one thing that you do to get away from it all, to decompress? Because you can't be 24/7, 365.
No, you can't. I didn't learn this lesson until later in my life, but funny enough, I hated running in high school and I hated running early in my 20s, and I love it. There is nothing better than a runner's high. That I really got into it during the pandemic whenever we all had to go home and I needed to get out of the house because I'd used to go to the office and row on a row machine.
Mhm.
And w- being at home and the gym shut down, I just started getting out walking, and the next thing you know, it turned into running. But I can't do it with music.
Oh,
I
yeah.
have to do it with an audiobook.
It's funny you mentioned that. Well, first of all, I mean, I've been running for ages. I don't do nearly as much running as I used to. I've done marathons before, but yeah, first of all, that once you get past like that first mile or so, mile, maybe a little bit more, you get the endorphins kicking in. You really do get that runner's high, and if you're not focused so much on time, if you're just focused being present in the environment as you're jogging, that's what I always look forward to in the springtime because that's when I go back out and run. Right now, for me, it's indoor cycling, but you need to have that break away from it. So, and then you mentioned about music or whatever. It's just like I can't listen to anything. I sometimes would listen to podcasts, and I would recommend that if folks want to listen to podcasts, they should listen to this one when they
There
run.
we go.
Uh, but I just like being in the element by myself and nature doing pat. So I'm on board with you there. What kind of future plans do you have, either professional or personal? You're going to run a marathon? Have you run a marathon before?
I've ran a half marathon.
Okay.
I don't know if I'll do the full, but I said I
You're
would
you're
never do
only
a
half
half.
as yeah, you're only half as crazy is what they say.
Yeah. So it was funny was is that when I started running more and more, everyone's like, "Are you gonna run a half marathon?" I'm like, "No, no, I'm good." And then next thing I know, I look at my one of my runs one day, and I'm like, "Oh wow, I just did a half marathon." So why not? I'll just go compete in one. The day I competed in it, it was raining. It was 30 something degrees outside. It was New Year's Eve, and yeah, I still did it. My wife thought I was crazy and she was super proud of me for it, but
Yeah, the thing about doing any sort of runs is that, I mean, no, you should always train in the worst conditions because you never know on that day. I have dealt with just about all sorts of conditions. I'd rather have 35 degrees and rain as opposed to 90 degrees and 90%
yes.
humidity and straight sunshine. I remember one time in Nashville with that, and just about killed me. So you're going to continue running, and then professionally continue on the virtual CISO side
Yes,
and
sir.
all that other stuff.
So we're starting a new initiative. We're calling it Cyber Aware at Flare this year, where we're gonna do a little bit. We haven't figured out all the tweaks of how we're gonna engage our customer base, but the goal there is to bring awareness around cybersecurity even more than we have over the last 2 years, and continue to grow that practice.
You could name those modules that you for awareness. You can name them pieces of flair, and
I
and you
love
could
it.
have that one for free. Office Space, Jennifer Aniston.
Oh
The
yes.
every time I think of flair, I think about that. But yeah, pieces of flair.
So one last thing that I started doing this last week is we for Christmas I got my girls a laptop. I've got a 5 and 7 year old,
Oh.
and I was personally 7 years old when my mom gave me a desktop, and it was a Tandy 1000 HX. And I'm probably showing my age right about there, but my girls they got their first one, and I will say after my oldest who has taken piano has picked up on where the keys are within a couple of days of getting curriculum because we homeschool, and for her doing the curriculum has been amazing over this last week of just going to town on it.
That's awesome. Well, don't feel so old. I think my first experience with a computer was, I believe I was in 6th grade, and we actually sat in front of a teletype machine, which was connected via modem using one of those phone cradle things to a town called Terrytown, which is about 15 miles away. And we played tic-tac-toe, and it would print out on that thing. And that would be 1978. So I've
Fair
been around
enough.
for a while. Well, listen, Brent, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and I appreciate the conversation. Some really good advice in there and really good stories. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Greg. Have a great day.
You too. And everybody, stay secure.